Okay, welcome to the workshop for the Society of Public Education. The way this will work is that for about the first half, I'll present some more theologically based thoughts on integrating faith in public education, just to lay a common foundation for everyone. And then Rensy and Rayna will take over for the second half with more organizational items. And our goal is to be done in about an hour. It might be a lot sooner than that. And so if we have time, we can have a little time for discussion and questions, feedback, that kind of thing. So with all that said, let's dive right in. These are the questions I'm basically going to cover during my time. What is the gospel? What does the gospel have to do with work in general? What does the gospel have to do with public education more specifically? How has Christianity transformed public education historically? What is the state of public education in North America today, especially like what are the challenges facing public education today? And what can Christianity offer public education today? So first, what is the gospel? One of the first problems we have to face in answering this is that we have an overly privatized view of the gospel. So one of the things we have to separate out is the difference between private truth and public truth. Private truth is the understanding that something is true for me. It's something closer to an opinion. Public truth is something that is true for everyone. It's a claim about reality that's accepted as true for everyone. So think of scientific truth or mathematical truth or historical truth. The chemical formula for water is H2O, 2 + 2 = 4. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, that kind of thing. But private truth is a lesser kind of truth. It's just true for me. So my favorite color is navy blue, but that's not true for you because your favorite color is pink or black or whatever. The gospel is treated in our society more like a private truth. It's something that's true for me, but it doesn't have to be true for you. But what the gospel really is a public truth. It's a claim about reality. It's a claim about, it's a historical claim. It's a claim that in Jesus Christ, God has decisively acted to reconcile all things to himself. So when we think about this question, we have to keep at the forefront of our minds that the gospel is basically news about the accomplishment of a fact. And the fact that God has reconciled all things to himself in Jesus has all these different implications. It means that I am saved from sin, wrath, death, and the devil. It means that it is now possible for us to create a new human society that operates on the basis of mutual service and love, not on the basis of power. It means that the law of entropy is not the final world, not the final word on the destiny of our world. Like the universe is not hurtling towards a final death, but it will be resurrected and heaven and earth will be reunited in the new creation. So one of the simpler ways to restate the gospel is to basically say, Jesus is Lord. He is the crucified and risen Lord of the world. And therefore, the Lordship of Jesus has implications for all of life. So I talked about this at the session in 2018 on integrating the gospel with work. And I'm just going to give a brief rundown on how the gospel transforms our work more specifically in these 5 different ways. I've taken these from Every Good Endeavor by Tim Keller, which I've talked about before. So first, the gospel gives you a new identity without which work would crush you. Second, the gospel gives you confidence in the dignity of all work without which work could bore you. Third, the gospel gives you a moral compass without which work could actually corrupt you. Fourth, the gospel gives you a new worldview without which work could become your master instead of your servant. So work has this ability to change our worldview, and Christians as salt and light in the world are supposed to bring our worldview into our work and transform our work. And then finally, the gospel gives you hope. And I just want to talk a little bit more about this one because this is one that I think has a lot of relevance for me in my work, and I think might have a lot of particular relevance for folks who are working in public education. Anyone who has worked for even a little while starts to realize that even the best things you do in work are partial or incomplete or inadequate. So I can imagine someone who's a teacher looking back at the end of the year and thinking, there was more that I could have done for my kids. There was more that I could have done to reach this one student who was so hard to reach. And over time, as those kind of experiences accrete or accrue, that can become very wearing, and it can lead to a kind of despair. But the gospel tells us that God graciously includes everything we do in work in his work in reconciling all things to himself. And so even the impartial victories will be redeemed by God. They matter. And a verse that's really important to me that kind of expresses that truth is the verse from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 58, where Paul writes, "Therefore, my beloved, be steadfast, immovable, always excelling in the work of the Lord, because you know that in the Lord your labor is not in vain." And I've always loved, N.T. Wright points this out, that verse where Paul says, "In the Lord your labor is not in vain," comes at the end of a very long chapter. I mean, for 57 verses before, Paul had been talking about the resurrection of Jesus and the implications of the resurrection for us. And I think what Paul is saying, and N.T. Wright kind of spells this out in his commentary on this passage, Paul is saying that because of the resurrection of Jesus, our work that seems so futile sometimes is not wasted. It has eternal consequences. God is mysteriously but graciously including it in the divine and eternal kingdom that he's ushering in. And so I think that provides a lot of hope, and in particular, it might provide a lot of hope for folks who work in public education. So what does the gospel have to do with public education more specifically? Of course, Jesus is presented to us in the Gospels as the great teacher, but one of the things that's striking in looking at Jesus as an educator is that he was unique for his time in his choice of students. In the world Jesus lived in, the prestige of the teacher would grow with the prestige of the students. So like the more prestigious students you could attract, the more your own reputation would grow. So for example, Aristotle, who lived in ancient Greece a few centuries before Jesus, was brought into greater honor as a teacher because his pupil was the Prince of Macedonia, Alexander the Great, who went on to conquer much of the known world at that time. But Jesus chose students who would have been despised and looked down upon, and he chose to reveal the secrets of his identity and his kingdom to them. Fishermen like Peter, Andrew, James, and John, working class people, right? A hated tax collector, someone who's seen as a traitor, like Matthew. Zealot, who might have been like a violent revolutionary, that's what zealots usually did, like Simon. And to women, like Jesus had a lot of women followers, and at the time, Jewish rabbis would not ordinarily have been teaching women. That was not something that was done, but Jesus was constantly teaching women. We have the story of Mary and Martha, when Martha was kind of getting things ready and was angry that Mary was sitting at Jesus's feet. One of the things that was going on in that passage is that Mary was violating gender norms by sitting at Jesus's feet as a disciple who was learning from the rabbi. And so Jesus taught women. It kind of gives truth to what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 27. God chose the foolish things of the world, from the opinion of the world, the foolish things, to shame the wise. Jesus intentionally went after those that the world kind of rejected and gave them the benefits of his education. And in doing this, Jesus revealed that his teaching, which leads to true life, is for everyone, but only for those who are willing to accept it and humble themselves and leave behind the wisdom they thought they had in order to receive the wisdom that he offers. So how did those truths transform public education? How did Christian truths transform public education in history? The early church used education in Roman society as a tool of evangelism, especially by welcoming the poor those who would not be able to access the regular sources of education in Roman society, that Christians offered them education for their own flourishing, and through that they were also able to share the gospel with them. This focus on education continued throughout the medieval period in Europe, but then had hit a higher gear after the creation of the printing press and the Protestant Reformation. With the creation of the printing press, it was now possible for the first time for every Christian family to own their own copy of the Bible. Before that, you would have a Bible in church, but it would literally be chained to the pulpit so that people couldn't steal it because it was so expensive to create a Bible. Like, monks would have to copy it by hand. Now, with the printing press, you could make the Bible available more cheaply to everyone. And so with the Reformation, it became a really high value in making sure that families could read the Bible on their own. Especially because now the Bible was translated not just into Latin or Greek, but into the languages that the people in Europe could actually read, like German, French. And so the reformers like Luther and Calvin encouraged study of the Bible, and they realized that in order for people to study the Bible, they needed to learn how to read. So Germany under Luther, Geneva under Calvin, all these different reformers in the different areas and regions they were in had this huge emphasis on building schools attached to the churches in order to provide mass education for men and women, because they believed that men and women needed to be able to read the Bible. By the time of the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, English society was at a point of development where many of the children weren't able to attend school because they were working in factories during the week. So the church adapted to that and began Sunday school primarily as a way to teach the kids how to read and write on Sundays, again, so that they could study the Bible on their own. From these efforts eventually came the state-run schools in Britain, Canada, and the US, and all around the world that we have today. So Christians really formed the basis for like the state-run public education system we have, especially in Western society, but all around the world now. What are some challenges facing public education in North America today? The first challenge is the challenge of educational equity. It is becoming more and more apparent that gender, race, class, and zip code all serve as obstacles to children receiving an education that allows them to reach their full capacity. I think this is, to be honest, always been true, at least in the United States, but it's a truth that is now becoming so apparent that people are demanding action for the state to provide educational equity in some way. The second challenge is the battle over school curriculums. That's happening in Canada and it's happening in the United States. As demographics have become more diverse, there have been a lot of questions about the rightness of continuing a more Anglo-based education curriculum. And there are a lot of questions about that. Who gets to decide what the curriculum should be, and on what basis do they get to decide? There's a lot of differences in these curriculum battles that seem to be based not just on what the science says helps students learn better, but also based on value judgments on what should be presented to students and what should not be presented to students. And the last challenge is a little bit more philosophical. There seems to be a crisis of confidence in truth that is in the culture at large, but that is now affecting public education. The basic question is, how can I be confident that I know what I know? People are becoming a lot less certain in all sorts of things, and I think that's because people are less confident in truth. In philosophy, this is called the problem of epistemology. How can I be confident that I know that I know? It seems more and more like rational argument is giving way to arguments based on emotional or tribal appeals. So by making that statement, are you revealing that you're with us or that you're with them? And so that's breaking down our ability to really discover truth in a more dispassionate way. And it's even affecting our confidence that objective truth even exists. So how should Christians enter in to answer those questions? like I told the last group, I don't have any answers to the questions I posed. And I'm sorry if that disappoints you, but to me, that's actually the purpose of this group. It's while knowing the gospel and staying rooted in the gospel, I would like for this group to engage with these kinds of questions, not just intellectually, but also at the level of professional practice. And to help you guys get started on that, I would like for you to spend this first year together studying one of these two books. I kind of like talked about these options with Rensy and Rayna, and I'll leave it to you guys what y'all want to focus on. The first book that I'd recommend y'all consider is Education for Human Flourishing. And although I haven't read it personally, it was recommended to me by a person I trust as the most comprehensive introduction to thinking through education from a Christian worldview, period. So it seems like a really interesting book to consider. The second book is a book I have read. It's called Loving to Know. And it's really more concerned with answering that last challenge that I spoke to you about, the challenge of epistemology, of being confident that you know what you know. So it's up to you guys what books you want to focus on this first year. I just hope and pray that your time together will prove fruitful and will lead to creative mission in North America. So that's all I had to share with you guys this morning. With that, I'll turn it over to Rensy and Rayna.
So was there any questions regarding to what Bryan talked about for our group? I know there's outside people who joined in too. Any questions? No? Okay. So there's on our group meet, I sent out a link for the educational equity. I'm not too sure who watched that video yet, but we're gonna do another talk on a different session for that right now. But right now, I'm just gonna talk about 5 key points on how we could share your faith in the public school. So first, if our students are ever going to be open to what we have to say, they need to see Christ in who we are and what we do. So love your students and be an example of a believer, showing him through your daily interactions. Second, embrace the truth. So every single student, every single teacher, they have preconceived philosophies and ideas that they bring with them to the classroom. And the difference is that ours is the truth. There are restrictions, but God's truth should be a part of you, that they impact everything you do and naturally weave themselves into your teachings and interactions. If they aren't, then you need to get into the Word and really start to embrace its truth, allowing them to impact every part of you. So God's truths are not just for Sunday mornings, they are still true for the rest of the week. Third, objectively discuss faith when it applies to the curriculum. So according to the Liberty Council, you are absolutely free to discuss you're discussing ancient Egypt. It is appropriate to discuss their religious beliefs and how they differ from the beliefs people commonly hold today. So the goal of such discussions should be to get the students thinking and to prompt them to ask questions, because if they ask questions, you are then free to answer them, like talking about faith. The fourth one, honestly answer questions about your faith. So if you have the freedom to answer questions that students ask of you, whether it is in the classroom or one-to-one. So when students ask you a question that relates to your faith, answer it as openly and honestly as you can. So if you feel it's necessary, you can begin your response by letting them know that this is your personal belief or opinion. And lastly, pray for students and for opportunities to speak. Spend time praying for students as well as their parents and fellow teachers, and ask specifically that God would not only give you opportunities to speak truth into their lives, but that he would help you recognize and take advantage of them. So next, I'm gonna give it to Rayna. She's gonna talk about this workshop that we're planning to do for her.
I haven't watched that video already. I definitely recommend you watch it. It, like Rensy highlighted most of the important points, but it's a good watch for sure. I'm just gonna talk about some of the like practical things that we have planned so far for our group. So as Bryan mentioned, we are going to do somewhat of a book club together, and we're going to choose the book Education for Human Flourishing. It's by Paul Spears and Stephen Loomis. I haven't read reading it together, and the format we were thinking was like dividing it into 4. That's what Bryan suggested to us, and we think that would work. So divide the book into 4, and we would meet 4 times throughout the year by, I think, next summer. And either Rensy and I could have discussion questions ready each time, or like a different person could take the lead for each session. So that's something we got to kind of discuss and decide amongst ourselves. I haven't read the book, but I was reading up a little bit, just like a summary of it. And so just to summarize it, it pretty much talks about what us as Christian educators have to contribute within the framework of public education, specifically in the Western culture. How can we make our voices heard in a society that often rejects religious views within education? So I think that's a really important point. And it talks pretty much about educational philosophy, social ethics, issues, and other questions within education, policy, leadership, and all of those. So that's our plan for the book club. Another idea that came up was we could also host like a Zoom session with a guest speaker. So if anyone knows like a teacher, like an experienced teacher who can also speak on the topic of like the intersection of faith and education in the workplace and stuff, we could have them jump onto a Zoom session with us and kind of share their insights. I have someone in mind, but also if any of you guys that I know, if any of you guys have anyone that you know, let us know and we can put that together. I think that would be a good experience for us. But yeah, that's kind of it from my end, from our end. Does anyone have any questions or anything else to add? Bryan, do you have anything to add?
Well, I think one of the things I'm curious about, I interacted with more people from the Society of Medicine earlier, so I kind of have a better sense of like what everyone was interested in, and so I'm curious, like for the folks who are on the call who are working in education or interested in education, like what are you guys hoping to get from this group? So I'd like to.
Yeah, so one of the questions, I guess, that I had, which I guess we'll explore as we do the book and discuss and stuff, was like how do we incorporate, you know, this public truth that you were talking about into like an atmosphere that usually looks down upon sharing that kind of truth, especially like specifically in education. Like for me, like I'm lucky because I teach in a Catholic school, so I'm allowed to do that kind of stuff, but for most of us, we don't. And like if you do that kind of stuff, like parents might come after you and like be upset and go to administration and things like that. It happens a lot. You without, you know, getting reprimanded for it and things like that. Yeah, that's something that a concern that I had. Or yeah, anyone else?
Yeah, I would just like to piggyback on what you're saying right now. Like, I think this group could go into a lot of different directions because on one hand, there is that sort of like in the classroom, how do I represent Christ well, including like verbally pointing towards Christ, because that is a truth that we hold dear, and not like being ashamed of Christ, while still honoring the fact that I'm in like a secular public school for those who are in secular public schools. So that's like one question. Then there are more systemic questions of like how do Christians engage in those kind of like struggles I was talking about for curriculum or for educational equity, and making sure that that we like kind of tip our resources towards the most disadvantaged students instead of our current system, which seems to tip our advantages towards those who are already privileged. So there's sort of those more systemic questions. And then there's also just, I mean, all of you guys are young. So like, how do you guys hone the craft of teaching? How do you guys become better workers in public education? Like it's what Luther would call like the ministry of competence. How do you become better and better at your craft? So I think those are three different directions this group could focus on. I guess what I'm curious is like, for those of you who are on the call, like other than Rensy and Rayna, like what are you guys attracted to? Like what would you guys like to focus on in those three different dimensions of public education? And don't be shy sharing. Nothing you say will be stupid.
Hey, so it's Anu here. So I'm not a teacher, obviously. Like I was in both sessions this morning. But I think something that I don't know if this is helpful, but this is something that I learned when I was studying to become a psychotherapist was I had professors who would remind us that like we're not going to always be able to share our faith in the most direct way, like as we would in church, or if we're working in a Christian school or a Catholic school or whatever it might be. However, there's a difference between, for us, like for me specifically, there's a difference between calling myself a Christian counselor and being a counselor who is Christian. And I think the same would apply for all of you as teachers, and like in that field where there's a difference between being like a Christian teacher, like you might be able to identify yourself that way, but you're also a teacher who happens to be a Christian. And there's a piece where people can't really pinpoint that. They can't fault you for that. It's a choice that you're making. However, the way that you teach, the way that you behave, the way that you carry yourself is going to be the biggest impact on children, on their parents, and your colleagues, et cetera, et cetera. So I know that like a lot of people, you know, have pointed people to me like, oh, can you give them counseling? You're a Christian counselor. And I have to kind of correct them because, and I'm thankful for that professor that kind of identified the difference, is like, I am a counselor who is Christian. So it informs how I do my work. It informs how I see people. It informs how you would work with children or see the value and the inherent value in each one of them. But it doesn't mean that you're like going against what you're called to do in the school system if you're working in the public school system. Does that make sense? So I don't know if that was here or there. However, that was something that really has helped me in my own profession. And I think it applies everywhere.
Yeah, that's really good. Anyone else have questions for Rensy or Rayna, or just feedback? Want to tell them they did a really good job?
And you guys did a really good job.
Thanks, Anish.
Hi, it's Sonu here. Yes, definitely both have done such a great job with this. I think it's a great initiative, and it's funny because last night I was there for Bryan's, like, you know, his outlook and like the last few years, 6 years of being youth representative. Oh my goodness, I can't believe it. So seeing all this kind of play out, it's been really awesome. And I'm not a teacher either, but my mom is a teacher in the Canadian context. And I think growing up, not for me, but even when like in India, the women, they'd always say like you had two choices, either you're a nurse or you're a teacher. And because of that, most of the women in my family are teachers. But then the way they teach there is quite different from the way they teach here. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's getting a lot harder to teach the kids of today. Whether it's restrictions from the boards that you're working under, or the curriculum that you have to teach, or the socioeconomic backgrounds your kids are coming from. Like Rayna's told me a bit about what she's had to deal with, and I mean, I believe God placed her there for a reason. She's making a difference for sure. So I agree with what Sanu was saying about like faith is not a conversation that just, it should happen organically, and it shouldn't be, not that it shouldn't be, but I don't think that if you wake up, not that it's wrong, but if you can pray and like, Lord, if you want me to open up about my faith to the students, that's great, like let that open up. But I don't think like it shouldn't be something you force onto them, because as it is, they're, you know, they're sitting in, they're, you know, we're in the classrooms, they're already kind of, you know, either bored or they're just like, why am I here? Like it's just, because I'm kind of thinking of how I was at when I was, you know, that age in school. So, but I honestly, though, think that by having this group, hopefully, this is a way to open up that conversation, and but still, like, and so students will look at you and like, even though you don't, you're not broadcasting your faith, but they can say, you know, this, like Miss James is different or Miss Daniel is different. Like, you know, there's something about them that's really, and if you make a difference in their life, and I'm sure they'll remember you, or they'll come back and ask you, you know, what was that about? And you know, you can start talking about your, like, whatever changed you or whatever that was kind of. But I think, sorry, I guess that was is rambled on. There's not really a lot there, but anyway, again, just saying good job, and hopefully, like, you will get, or you at least you get the conversation started, and you'll have a very broad idea and broad perspectives as well, like both American and Canadian, North American in general, American and Canadian. But who knows? There might be others who have the way that things, like how they teach or how education works in their areas as well. So, good job, and keeping all of this in prayer, and let me know if I can help in any way. I'm not a teacher again, but like, you know, but still.
Awesome. Anyone else have some feedback for Rensy and Rayna? Is there anyone on the call who's like in the field of education but not a teacher? Or maybe studying and not actually working yet?
So I work at a university. I guess that's kind of education.
Oh, okay.
So I work for the master's program at University of Toronto, and it's kind of one of the bigger universities here. So yeah, I'm the academic coordinator, which means I just take care of all things academic, like exams and scheduling and all that fun stuff. And because my background is kind of the building I work in, not now because we're all from home, working from home, but it's kind of. So, and I work in the Department of Management, and I was having a conversation with a friend of mine, how, like, when, even if I'm not teaching, it's still like, how do I like be a Christian in a department like management, where you're talking about the big bucks, it's all capitalism. How do you make the most profit? How do you, you know, and everyone wants to get on top, whether you step on other people or not, like you just want to get on top. So it's kind of really hard to do that. But I honestly, I'm like, okay, no matter how much I want to like punch a wall or want to, like, you know, yell at my students or even my boss when she's getting a little, you know, over, anyway, I had to remember, like, okay, hold on. I can't react in this way, because I know, because that would just, I do talk about my faith. They know that I'm a Christian, but they don't, like, that's not something that's, oh, okay. It's just, it's fine. Like, whatever, people can be whatever they want, I guess. But I don't want that to kind of downplay or put a bias on how I act. And so, or just because I'm a Christian doesn't mean I can't get upset if something is not going right, you know. And even with finding with the students, it's kind of, it's tough, because they also come from different socioeconomic backgrounds, and University of Toronto is like, it's expensive, and any university expensive. I know we're actually lucky in Canada, because we have, from what I understand, like we're not paying as much as you guys do in the States. So that's one good thing, but still, it's not, you're not talking about pennies here. So yeah, so that's kind of what my background is. Even though I'm not a teacher, I'm in the educational field, I guess, in a way. Yeah.
Anyone else also, like, not teachers, but in public education? One of the things that I think is, like, kind of interesting just to think about is, you know, obviously I live in Texas, and so, like, the curriculum battles look a little bit different than they might be looking in New York or in Canada. So I remember when I was in high school in Texas, it might have changed now, but probably not. Like we had prayer in the morning, like a moment of silence. No one would actually pray, but we would have a moment of silence where people could pray. And before school actually started, a lot of the teachers would like gather at the flagpole. It would be like, see you at the pole, and people would all like pray together. And that was interesting growing up that way, because I had a lot of friends as a student who were non-Christians, and they felt kind of alienated because of all that. So it's just interesting, like different tensions that different choices lead to, right? And so I'm wondering like what it's like how does faith play out in public schools in New York or in Canada? I'm sure it's very different from like what happens in Texas, where sometimes it feels more like the people in power in Texas kind of like push Christianity a little bit more. And there are pluses and minuses to that. I think it's probably different up north, right?
Maybe like Sonshich, you can speak on this, because I, like, even as a student, I went to Catholic school my whole life. So we started the morning with our national anthem and prayers. We had mass every month. We had like virtue of the month assemblies. Like we'd have religion class 4 times a week, and in high school you have to take a religion course all 4 years. So maybe one of the other Canadians can talk about what it's like in the public school system.
Sure. So I don't quite remember if I went experience it, but I've been told that we used to say the Our Father at assemblies. And I went to a public schools all like up to, I guess
I think
always.
that was, yeah, I don't think we did it, Sonu.
Yeah, I don't think we did either, but I've heard it's like, it's like it was there, but then someone complained, and then like, it was kind of, yeah, removed. So I don't really, the only Christian I think that we would do was we would sing carols at Christmas, and that's always like even Away in a Manger or George the World. Everyone knows it. They're like, it's clearly there's a Christian message there, but I think that's the extent, if I'm not mistaken. So.
Rensy, what are things like in New York within the public schools?
Well, we don't really talk about like we don't do the Lord's Prayer or anything like that in the morning, but in public schools. But when I went to Catholic school, yeah, we did for my college. We did have to do like the moment of silence, the prayer in the morning, or the professor would pray for like 2 minutes in the morning, and then he would close off the class with like a short prayer too. But that's like in our theology class, we would do that, and sometimes in our philosophy classes. But there's no like prayers or like anything Christian based like that they did in public schools here that I know of. But yeah.
Yeah, Stacy here. I went to public schools, like especially like New York City schools, my whole life, and there's definitely no like religion related anything, like no prayers, no anything like that. The only thing we started our days off with was like the Pledge of Allegiance, and that was basically it. Maybe like in music class when we were younger, we would sing like those like America songs that has like, that alludes to God and things like that. But other than that, there's definitely no like religious aspect to any part of the school day.
Yeah, that makes sense.
This is Jacob from New Jersey. I had some experiences in New York and New Jersey where I'm aware that there are Christian clubs under the leadership of a Christian teacher. The teacher acts as a mentor or a supervisor for the Christian club where students meet. So that is going on in the Northeast.
Okay. Yeah.
And also among university students, there are organizations like the International Students Incorporation or InterVarsity or Crew or some other clubs, operating in the university where all these Christian organizations have their own staff working in particular universities. So, and I am part of this international student operation in New Jersey, working specifically among the FTU students here. So some work is going on even in the Northeast.
Yes, it's good. Anyone else have any feedback before I'll stop the recording soon. And you guys can stay on and just talk. Our next session is at 2 p.m. Eastern time. Vishal will be leading on law and government, so you guys can stay on and talk as long as you want. But any like kind of closing comments or last thoughts, things you're excited for this group?
I think another thing that I guess it will be nice to like figure out together, like something that is really real in the teaching field, and I honestly think in any field, is like teacher burnout. And so just like ways to, like from a Christian perspective, how to like get through that and stuff. Because sometimes I already reached that stage. But yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely a good thought too. And maybe we can have like a more particular focus on that, because I was reading in like Texas, there's like a burnout after 3 years, like a huge percentage of like new teachers drop in and go to something else. And part of the reason is just like the huge amount of stress. So yeah, definitely something to think about. Okay, well, I'm going to stop the recording.